In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Before we wrap up our series on Marian devotion, I wanted to make a little program announcement about the shape of programming in November. November is sort of a weird month. All Saints and All Souls Day falling on a Monday and a Tuesday, and then confirmation being the middle of the next week. I've had to shuffle the schedule around a little bit. So the series of talks like this that I had promised on the 4 last things are now going to end up in the bulletin, which is probably better because if I give those talks in person, they end up being 58,000 words long. In the bulletin, they're 800. So it saves you time, and I can only fit so many bad jokes into a bulletin note, which is probably better given the subject matter because it'll be the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. The main joke I've been making about hell lately is I walked into Spanish Mass about a month ago and looked, and there was hardly anybody there. And I asked one of the guys, kind of one of the leaders in the community, I said, "Where is everybody?" He said, "Well, there was a party tonight." I said, "Oh, that's nice." I said, "Do you know where there aren't any parties?" And he said, "Where?" And I said, "In hell." He said, "Father, you should preach about hell." And I said, "Well, the problem with that is that all the people who need to hear me preaching about hell wouldn't be here because they'd be at a party." So
go to the party.
the new tactic is I'm going to find out where these parties are, and I'm going to crash the party. So anyway, in November, death, judgment, heaven, hell. This will be talked about in the bulletin. Book discussion is going to be a little bit different, again, because Wednesdays and Thursdays are sort of oddly occupied this month. So we will begin discussing 3 Philosophies of Life by Peter Kreeft, which is a delightful little book. It's not very long, but he has a tendency to pack a lot in there. It won't be as much of a slog as The Noonday Devil was in terms of how technical it is, because Kreeft is a very rhetorical and at times kind of poetic writer. So he's more, basically, if you want to read C.S. Lewis, but you're put off by how, I dread to say this, but how English he is, then Kreeft is sort of that kind of tamped down a little bit and made a little bit more sort of tighter prose. So this will be the first book by Peter Kreeft we read. We might read 1 or 2 more next year because he is phenomenal, probably one of the greatest minds in modern American Catholicism. I used to email with him some when I was in seminary. I was in touch with him, and then the email account that I had emailed him on was a school one, and I don't have it anymore, so I actually don't remember his email address. But I've met him. I've heard him speak before. He's fantastic. So the first discussion will actually be on All Souls Day, Tuesday, November 2nd. We'll go back to the usual time, Lourdes at 9:30, and the discussion at 10. And then back to Wednesday, the 10th and 17th of November. And then the next week is the week of Thanksgiving, so we won't have any extra programming then. The offices could be closed that week anyway, so just there won't be any extra programming or anything like that then. So just a little program note about what's going on in November in case you are interested in that. I actually got the first of the bulletin notes on the 4 last things done last night. Looking ahead to December, those talks also, given that December is sort of an odd month in there as well, with Christmas and Christmas falling on a Saturday this year, which is lots of fun. Lots of fun liturgically and lots of fun for my commute. The series I had planned for December, I'm now going to present as videos on YouTube on St. Athanasius's On the Incarnation. Those will come out at probably something like a regular interval. And then the book discussion, we're actually going to punt that one until after the first of the year, just to kind of free up a little bit of time during Advent when there's, first off, not as many people here. What people are here maybe aren't able to get here because of the weather or things like that. So December is going to become a month of sort of breaking from this kind of programming just to maintain due order and sanity. So anyway. So we've touched on in talking about Marian devotion. As I said, I didn't want this to be a discussion solely of the Church's Marian dogmas and doctrines, but we have to discuss those things insofar as they are formative for devotion. And as I've pointed out in a few instances, as devotion has been formative of those things, that the way people are praying, very often the magisterium of the church is going to be responsive to that. That clearly people are praying, if people are praying in an authentic way, then the response to that sometimes is to take things that are being talked about, make sure that they're in line with what has been handed down, and actually then kind of codify them as formal teachings of the church. And this happens quite a lot when we talk about the Assumption of Mary. The dogma of the Assumption wasn't declared until 1950. Does that mean that the Catholic Church never believed in the Assumption of Mary until 1950? No. It means that had been talked about up to that point. We don't just, the Pope doesn't just sort of mount his cathedra, his throne, and pull doctrine out of his hat. That it's more the codification of things that have been taught or been believed, and the way belief is manifested is through prayer. The church has always had the maxim of lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of praying is the law of believing. So in one sense, it goes in the direction you think. The way you pray is going to influence how you believe. But then it also goes in the other direction as well. The way we believe influences how we pray, and the church has always sort of been sensitive to that. One of the ways that we will see that will be the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Before we get there, though, in 1830, we have one of the more significant sort of developments in Marian devotion, one of the more recognizable developments in Marian devotion. And notice I've skipped ahead quite a lot because I think last time we finished off talking about the Reformation and a little bit of the Renaissance, and then we've skipped 200 or 300 years in there. I'm sure nothing of note happened in the 18th century or anything, so we'll just move on. It's not like the French Revolution had any kind of bearing on society, culture, or the church. But and I'm going to pay for that because at some point now I'm going to have to give a series of talks on the French Revolution and how it shaped society, culture, and the church. But anyway.
Yeah, purgatory.
and maybe use it in Chestertonian fashion. As an oblique beating stick for the postmodern culture, because Chesterton, the first book of Chesterton I ever read was his biography of St. Francis of Assisi. Thinking, it's 120 pages. I can read this in an afternoon, and it's going to be a book that's going to tell me a lot about St. Francis of Assisi because Chesterton was well steeped in history and in devotion, and this will be good. 6 weeks later, I finished reading it. And it's the kind of book that you read about 3 pages and then you have to put your head between your knees for the rest of the afternoon and think about your life really hard because Chesterton is heavy. That Chesterton is the sort of like steak and glass of scotch and 2 cigars of writers. And his biography of St. Francis of Assisi isn't really a biography of St. Francis of Assisi. It's a diatribe against the modern world and everything it's doing wrong that uses Francis of Assisi as a baseball bat for beating it up. So perhaps I shall do the same with my forthcoming series on the French Revolution, which I had never intended to do until like the moment I spoke that sentence. Jim is probably going to hold me to that.
How are you going to do that in French?
I could. I mean, see, Jim. The thing is, at a certain point, writing down what books I'm going to do, things like that. I'm going to just have you follow me around. You're just going to ride along in the car with me, and you're going to I'm going to just start narrating all these things I want to write, and you're going to transcribe them for me. There's a long.
Well, there is
medieval.
Right. No, there's a long tradition of that. I mean, Aquinas had Brother Reginald, his secretary, who followed him around and wrote down everything he said. So I need that. Anyway, on July 18th, 1830, a young religious sister by the name of Catherine Labouré had an apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She sees Mary standing atop a globe and crushing the head of a snake on top of this globe. And rays of light emanate from her hands. This will go on to, if this sounds familiar, it's probably because you wear the miraculous medal, because that's what it is. That is the image I'm describing. Mary asked that a medal be struck. And the medal has the words around it, "O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee." On the reverse of the medal, there's an M that is topped with a cross that's sort of intertwined with the M. It shows how Mary stood by the cross and was very intimately connected with the work of salvation by Jesus. Underneath the M and the cross are two hearts. One has the Sacred Heart, which is, both of the hearts are on fire, which is a symbol of love. And then the Sacred Heart has a crown of thorns surrounding it, and the Immaculate Heart of Mary has a sword piercing it. There are a lot of scriptural references here. Mary crushing the head of a serpent is a reference to Genesis 3:15, when God says to the snake in the Garden of Eden that he'll put enmity, there will be enmity between him and the woman, and her offspring will, and between her offspring and the offspring of the snake. And it actually says in the Hebrew, he will crush your head. It's saying that the offspring of the woman will crush his head. In the Vulgate, there are some other manuscript traditions that Jerome was working from. And so in the Latin, it comes down to us in the Latin as she will crush your head, which has always been taken by the church fathers as a reference to the Immaculate Conception, that the purity of Mary defeats defeats original sin. And the original sin had been embodied by the snake who tempted Eve. The Immaculate Heart, of course, a reference to Scripture there, when Simeon takes the infant Jesus in the temple into his hands and says, this one is destined for the rise and the fall of many, to be a sign that will be contradicted, and a sword will pierce your soul as well, so that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed, that Mary will share in her son's passion. There's another scriptural reference on the miraculous medal on the back. It's surrounded by 12 stars, which is a reference to Revelation 12. A great sign appeared in the heavens, a woman clothed with the sun, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. 12 being a very biblically significant number. It was originally the 12 tribes of Israel. It is the 12 apostles who are supposed to be as Jesus says, they will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, which is a reference to the church. That the church is the new Israel. And so the apostles represent then the judges, kind of the chiefs of the 12 tribes of the new Israel. So 12 is sort of a thing of the assembly of God in its totality. And so this shows that Mary is crowned with 12 stars in Revelation, shows that she is sort of the queen of the new Israel, which is another biblical reference that how can you be the queen if you're not married to the king? And in the Old Testament reckoning, in the sort of the realm of the history of Israel, that the queen mother was as powerful as a queen would be. For more on this, I actually recommend, and where I learned this first was when I was about 14. I read Scott Hahn's Hail, Holy Queen. I think it's one of his better books. I've probably made some comments, probably not on video and not in public, but I've made some I have in public, but I've made some comments about what I think of Scott Hahn's books. Scott Hahn's books are fine. I found myself not being his intended audience about 2 years into an undergrad degree in theology, but they were good when I was first kind of starting out. And he's very good with showing you the scriptural bases for Catholic teaching. The Lamb's Supper is another good one. It's like if you only read 2 books by Scott Hahn, read The Lamb's Supper and read Hail, Holy Queen. The Lamb's Supper is about how the book of Revelation, the heavenly worship that's depicted in the book of Revelation, is the Catholic Mass. That when we go to Mass, we are in the book of Revelation. And my response to that is I really want there to be some leopards with 70 eyes or whatever. I don't, all the... Those when I get the Seventh-day Adventist pamphlets that have all the sumptuously illustrated images from Revelation, because they're committing the folly of the medieval illuminators who tried to illustrate the things in Revelation, even though those things were meant to be allegorical and were not really meant to be sort of actual visual images. And so you end up with some very interesting images in those Seventh-day Adventist pamphlets, and they're not depicted in nice, flat, iconic medieval illumination style. They're depicted in garish, early 90s pastel watercolor sorts of looks. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. But anyway, so the miraculous medal, also Mary is shown with rays of light emanating from her hands. This image is sometimes called Our Lady of Grace as well, that the image of Mary on the miraculous medal and the image called Our Lady of Grace are virtually the same image. And the light emanating from her hands is supposed to be the graces that she attains for people who seek her intercession. I believe that Catherine Labouré says that she has rings on her fingers and the light seemed to emanate from the rings. This devotion has become extremely widespread to the point that the miraculous medal is one of those sort of really ubiquitous symbols of Catholicism. It's a handy thing when you are making the rounds doing chaplaincy work in a hospital, and you walk into someone's room and you spot a miraculous medal and you instantly know that they're Catholic. That it's one of those very distinctive, very iconic things. There are multiple apostolates dedicated to spreading the miraculous medal. Some of them go back to when it first originated in 1830. When I was first kind of reading my way into caring about my faith, which is the best way to sort of describe that. I'm not a convert. I just didn't really know anything until I was about 14 and started studying up. So I could argue with people. Got out of a lot of Spanish sophomore year, a whole lot of Spanish class. The 59-minute filibuster about contentious areas of Catholic teaching that could get our teacher going, and then the remaining 16 minutes of class, it was up to the four girls in class to filibuster the roll call, and then with 7 minutes left, whine about how we couldn't possibly take the quiz today because we don't have enough time.
So
sometimes that
we
involves
have to be aware of the 14-year-olds in their confirmation class.
Right, yeah. Yeah, well, no, we truly don't, because until Sunday night, which was the very last class, none of them said a word for 6 weeks.
I know. It was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But I mean, post.
Oh, sure. Yeah, post confirmation for sure. Yeah, we got out a lot of Spanish sophomore year. That's why I didn't learn Spanish until I went to immersion several years later.
Well, punished.
Yeah.
I had to go to
Immersion.
Well, no, I would have gone anyway, because I mean, you don't actually, you take 3 years of high school Spanish and you learn more English in 3 years of high school Spanish than you do in 13 years of public school English. But anyway, so when I was at that stage though, and if you're a new convert, or if you're kind of a new revert or something like that, there's this thing that happens. And I don't know how well documented this is, but basically you want to buy all the Catholic stuff. When my dad was in RCIA, he would go on eBay and he would find these people were just selling, like, here's a box of 50 random Catholic books. And they wouldn't tell you what they were, just kind of the grab bag. And he'd spend like $15 on this like massive. And then when I would come home on breaks from school, because he converted while I was about a junior in college. And we would go through the books and he would let me pick out what I wanted. So I got all kinds of like biblical commentaries and stuff like that. And so you buy all the books. But when you were me, kind of at this stage, I was 14, I had no income. So I would go online and find all the free Catholic stuff and have that sent to me. And to this day, there are mailing lists I've been on for close to 2 decades that I'm still like 7 addresses later getting junk mail from. But I had all the free miraculous medals. I had all the free rosaries you could get. I had all the free little Catholic pamphlets and things. The Knights of Columbus Information Service, or whatever it's called, the Catholic Information Service that they run, they had a thing where you could actually get like a free book and the little like guide for studying it or something. So I got a Catholic guide to the Bible, and it's still on my shelf. I think I've read like a chapter of it maybe. But one of the things I got Catholic free stuff was the Central Association of the Miraculous Medal, and the Association of the Miraculous Medal, and the Knights of the Immaculata, or the Militia Immaculata, which that one is one of the older apostolates for the spread of the miraculous medal and just devotion to Mary in general, was founded by St. Maximilian Kolbe. That he looked around at the time in which he was living, which was the very early part of the 20th century, and saw that there were a lot of, first off, you're in a time of considerable social upheaval, that socialism is starting to become a cultural force. The monarchies in Europe have all sort of lost their prestige, if they even still exist, through World War I. And then things like Freemasonry are starting to take root and to influence people, and to even influence some people who are Catholic, like to pull people away from the church and things like that. So he founds the Militia Immaculata to kind of combat this, to promote the miraculous medal. He called the miraculous medal a spiritual bullet with which the devil is defeated, because of the graces it represents. He described it as a sort of mini catechism of the church's teaching on Mary. And I actually found this out kind of in real life, not just from reading it, but when I was in high school, I was on the bus one day and was talking to I had a miraculous medal on, and I was talking to the girl that sat in front of me on the bus, and she was Pentecostal, and she asked what my medal was. So I took it off, and I was describing all the symbols and things on it, and she said, wow, it's like there's so much teaching jammed into this medal. And I was like, yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point of it. So, that somebody kind of got that point. But that then sort of sums up for us again that Marian devotion is about pointing the way to Christ, that even these symbols of our devotion will contain and convey a lot of I won't say information. I don't like the word information there, but they do convey a lot of the teaching. And we do that with images like, perpetual help. There's a lot to that image, and we have a little explanation of it there beside it. Various kind of famous statues and things. Our Lady of Guadalupe is a prime example of this. It's one of those things that we see it all over the place to the point that it's almost become kind of tacky in its presentation. And it's become sort of just a cultural symbol. And it is a cultural symbol, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's not all it is. When you look at the image, that there's a lot to that image that teaches us a lot about who Mary is and thus who Jesus is. That Mary is depicted as an Aztec, she's in the dress of an Aztec maiden, and the black sash around her waist is what was worn by pregnant women to show that to kind of show that they were pregnant. There was some sort of ritual meaning to that. So Mary is pregnant in that image, and the stars on her cloak actually mirror the constellations. And if you map out where they're at, Leo, the lion, would be roughly where Jesus would be sort of situated within her body, because Jesus is the Lion of Judah. And there's a lot of other things as well about that image. The most fascinating thing about Our Lady of Guadalupe is the fact that cactus fiber does not last that long, that generally about 10 years it starts to kind of deteriorate. The image is over 500 years old and has shown no signs of deterioration. The paint isn't actually sitting on the image, it's sort of floating above it. And there are no brush strokes. That it does not appear to have been painted by any human being, by any human method that would have been known at the time. And moreover, they've done chemical analysis on the paint, and they can't figure out where it came from. So funny things like that. Anyway, this little detour from France to Mexico and back a couple of hundred years. Apparently there were things of note that happened between the Reformation and 1830, so we will probably keep tripping over them. The next big modern development in the history of Marian devotion. In 1854, Pius IX declared the dogma of the Immaculate Conception with the bull Ineffabilis Deus. And as I've said, this is not the first time. It's not that we just sort of sailed along and didn't really think about it. And then in 1854, Pius IX woke up one morning and said, you know what? Let's declare a dogma, because I can do that. This is something that, again, had been spoken of liturgically. It had been spoken of in the devotional life of people for centuries. If we look in the Byzantine liturgy, which is going to give us some of our best attestation of ancient belief, it calls Mary Immaculate all over the place, even though, weirdly enough, in the Eastern reckoning of things, the Immaculate Conception of Mary is not really talked about. And the reason for that is that in the East, they believe basically everybody was immaculately conceived. And then at least in the Orthodox churches and the Eastern Catholic churches, I think they sort of massage this a little bit so it doesn't contradict Catholic teaching, but they still express it much the same way. Which kind of goes back to what I've said, that Orthodoxy and Catholicism they are distinct churches, but not different religions. That we believe and practice pretty much all the same things. We just dress it up differently or talk about it differently at times. And some people will try to make hay from the fact that we talk about the Immaculate Conception differently than they do. But most of the people making hay on the contentious points of doctrine between East and West are bored 15-year-olds on internet forums who are trying to appear clever. Not that there's that many of those out there saying anything about anything, but anyway, see our discussion tomorrow on Fahrenheit 451. But again, this dogma has been believed, and you can actually go back to even like the 2nd and 3rd century when the preaching of the church fathers is starting to become a little more developed, and you'll hear this. The earliest mention of the fact that Mary might be immaculate is actually in Luke's gospel. Because when the angel appears to her and says, "Hail, full of grace," the word that he uses for full of grace, charitomene, is unique among ancient literature. I mean, it's found nowhere in the classical tradition. And it's only found in that one place in the New Testament. And Luke basically had to invent that word to describe what was being said there. And it's actually, if you look at the Greek grammatical structure of it, if you'll all remember a little bit of your introduction to biblical Greek, that the word that's being used there's two kind of interesting features. One is that it's in the vocative case, which means that it's a form of address. It's a name. So it's the difference between when we are talking about the Lord in Latin, we say Dominus. When we are talking to him, we say Domine. That you change the ending to tell that either we're talking about him or we're talking to him. So in that case, kakare tomine, the endings are actually weirdly similar in Greek. A lot of old Greek textbooks, I have one at home that's it's a reprint of one from like the 1930s that we actually used in college. That a lot of older Greek textbooks assume you already know Latin when you take Greek, because then it's easier to teach you all the declensions and things, the inflections. But again, it's in the vocative case, so the angel is calling her that by name. He's calling her full of grace. That full of grace is her name. If she had on one of those little name tag things, it would say, "Hello, my name is full of grace." And the word, as it is, the other important thing about it is that it is in that the voice and the tense in which it is indicates that Mary has been perfected in grace, that she's always been that way and always will be that way. That what's conveyed by the grammatical structure of that word is that this is her name, and it always has been and always will be. That this has been completed with it signifies something that has been completed within her. So if she is full of grace, that means there's no room in her for anything else. And thus no room in her for sin, original or actual. And so the roots of the teaching are there in what is found in the Gospel of Luke. But then, and the other thing, and I always talk about this is sort of the hidden manner of teaching the Immaculate Conception. Everywhere else in Scripture but there, when a mere human encounters an angel, they freak out and they lie prostrate and they cover their faces, because angels mediated the presence of God. And if an angel brought the presence of God to you, it was going to freak you out. You were afraid you were going to be annihilated by it. So everybody freaks out when they see angels. Even Joshua, who goes on to wrestle with an angel, he freaks out first. But go through every mention of an angel in Scripture, and that's what happens. Angels are terrifying. Mary kind of treats it like it's not an unusual occurrence. That she blows right past the fact that there is an archangel in her bedroom and just goes straight to, I wonder why he's calling me that. That's kind of weird, So the fact that Mary doesn't freak out, which then kind of makes it interesting when the angel says, "Do not be afraid, Mary." It's almost like he's reading that from his archangel script. That this is what archangels are supposed to do. And some people will look. It's really interesting too, and this is something I talk about with some regularity, and we'll probably talk about when we get to. Definitely in the time around Christmas when these things come up in the readings, people will talk about how Zechariah questions the angel and is struck dumb, and then Mary questions the angel and isn't. And what a lot of people will say, and this is a fairly modern interpretation of this, and by modern I don't mean that sort of derisively, I just mean in terms of timeline, that you're not going to see a lot of people saying this very, very, very early, because there's a good reason why not. But a lot of people recently kind of writing in sort of the flowery language of devotional said that's because Zechariah doubted and Mary asked in faith. And the problem with that is if you read the text, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. It doesn't give anything to indicate. They both asked the same question. And there's nothing in the context indicating that they asked the question with a different intention or sort of with a different spirit, other than the fact that Zechariah was not immaculately conceived and Mary was. But at this stage, we don't know that. The reason why Zechariah is struck dumb and Mary isn't is that Mary is the angel's metaphysical superior. That because Mary is immaculately conceived, she's already benefited from the redemption of Christ, even though Christ hasn't even been conceived at this point, but he's God, so he can kind of do that. He can do things outside of time. So she outranks the angel in the great chain of being. Zechariah is a human and doesn't outrank the angel in the great chain of being. And so she is speaking as a queen to one of her generals, and he is speaking as a private to one of his generals. And the treatment that they each get then reflects that one of them is acting within her station and the other one is punching way above his weight, basically. So that's why that happens like that in Luke's gospel. Go back and reread the Annunciation account and imagine that Gabriel's a little bit nervous to be talking to Mary, and it makes it make a little more sense.
See forthcoming book.
See my forthcoming book on the Gospel of Luke, because Luke talks about Mary and women and angels more than anybody else does.
So when,
Actually, see my
You may
forthcoming.
have been nervous about, because she has free will. She could have refused. I mean,
She could have refused,
Yeah.
and she could have sent
Or
him
he
away,
could.
and she could have, she outranks it.
those wings are true.
But it's kind of a thing of her being immaculately conceived is not deterministic. That she was immaculately conceived so that she could be the one to bear the Christ, because you can't if you're not. That basically, again, think about the fact that the Ark of the Covenant, which was not itself God, if you even touched it accidentally, you'd die. So to bear the presence of God unadulterated in a human womb, you have to be, it's not just there, people talk about, Mary being a fitting vessel, and that's part of it, but it kind of goes in the other direction too. It isn't just that it's more fitting for Jesus to be born to an immaculate mother. It's that for her benefit, so that she isn't annihilated by being in the presence of God in that way. One time I was driving, I was in Monroe, and it was right around Christmas time, and I was out making sick calls. And that was the day I learned how big Union County was, is because the parish of Monroe is like 10 or 15 minutes. The church is about 10 or 15 minutes from the western boundary of the county. I drove 45 minutes in the other direction to visit somebody in a nursing home in the middle of nowhere, and found out that Union County is absolutely gigantic, and that our parish territory as a consequence was too. But I was listening to the AM radio driving back, and I found a Baptist preacher on the AM radio, and he was talking about how Jesus being God, he believed Jesus was God. I would say probably about a third of the Baptists you're going to encounter will say Jesus is the Son of God, but he's not God, because they don't have a magisterium to help kind of keep the bounds on their dogmatic teaching. That the Bible, there are places in the Bible you can point to that say Jesus is divine. There are places where you can point to that says he's not, and so, or maybe don't say that he's not, but can be interpreted that way. But first off, I applauded the fact that he's talking about how Jesus is God, that Jesus is divine. But then he was saying, but Mary is just a creature. True. Good so far. Mary is just a human being. Good so far. Mary is sinful. Problem. So how can a sinful human being bear God within herself? And this is where, again, if you don't have a magisterium to guide your interpretation of Scripture, you start pulling things out of thin air. And I'm only saying thin air because I'm saying this in public. But what he says, there's a quote by Morgan Freeman in The Shawshank Redemption that ran through my mind when I was hearing this, and I won't quote it out loud right now. But what he said was that in Mary's womb, there was a membrane that protected her sinfulness from being annihilated by Jesus. There's a sin-proof membrane. And I was like, and you say we make stuff up. At least when we make stuff up, it makes sense. Because if I were to scan the Gospel of Luke or anything else in Scripture, let's just pretend the church fathers don't exist, because they already do. We want to level the playing field. Let's pretend the church fathers don't exist and that nothing was written about Christianity between the closing of the New Testament about the year 80-ish and the Protestant Reformation. Nothing was said or done by anybody for 1,500 years. Let's just pretend that's reality. There's nothing in the New Testament to indicate that at all. And it sounds ridiculous. That's again, that's good interpretational principles. The very first thing is, if it doesn't pass the test of it sounds really ridiculous, you probably shouldn't believe it. There are a lot of things we do believe that sound ridiculous that you have to that then in the context make more sense. But that was just completely made up.
Father, well, you know that the baby is contained in a bag of water. So
Oh, sure.
Remember.
There is,
And
but
maybe
those,
that's what he's alluding
but he was saying that was somehow sin-proof.
Oh, I see.
And I said, I gave a homily on this a couple of weeks later because I was so baffled by it. Because like the Feast of the Immaculate Conception was like probably days after this. And I was talking about this, and I was just like, I was so baffled by this. I was like, I wish there were a sin-proof membrane. If that were really true, then we need to culture that in a lab and then wrap all of ourselves in it so we can't sin.
I was going to say that the three kings probably would have been after that placenta big time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and it's amazing to me because there are things to indicate that maybe Mary. So again, where he goes wrong and then has to deviate even further, and it's kind of like shooting a gun. If you're off by a millimeter at the firing line, then 100 yards down the range, you're going to be off by several feet. The where he went wrong was saying Mary was not sinless. And part of that, and that may have been that and I don't know the man's heart, and I don't know what he was thinking at this point. But that may have been an attempt, because I've seen a lot of people who will try to argue certain things and try not to sound too Catholic. I know of a Church of Christ up in Virginia, near where I grew up, that they claim that they only believe what's in the Bible, and that all their practice is totally biblical. And they can make some arguments for that, whatever. But then they don't anoint the sick, even though it says very explicitly in the letter of James, call the elders of the church to anoint people who are sick. And the reason they don't do it is Catholics and Pentecostals do that, and we don't want to look like them. Well, where is that in the Bible that you shouldn't do that? So this sin-proof membrane thing, again, because we have a choice. We can either say Mary is sinless, which then, the Immaculate Conception then makes a lot more sense. And it's present in Scripture. It's subtle. I get it. It's not right there on the face of it. It's not like Gabriel shows up and says, all right, address I'm looking for. Okay, I'm at the house of Mary, who is immaculately conceived. Got it. That's not in there. I get that. That you have to understand what he's saying in Greek, and you have to then look at the import of the fact that he seems a little bit intimidated by her and not the other way around, as typically happens with angels. It's subtle. I get that. But then let's stop pretending the church fathers don't exist and read how they read that. And they said Mary was immaculately conceived. So if you go off the rails like that, because you're trying to sort of defend your brand identity, then you're going to start making things up. And that's where a lot of, again, that's sort of the fundamentalism as a reactionary phenomenon that's why it's so problematic, is instead of being having an openness to the truth. I believe it was, it may have been Chesterton. It's either Chesterton or Newman. I don't remember. But one of them said, it's better to believe everything than to believe nothing. Because if you believe everything, eventually you'll land on the right thing. I think it was Newman that said this, because he's talking about his own conversion, basically. If you believe nothing, or if you're closed off as to admitting anything else into your belief, you're never going to find the truth. And what you do have in the truth will sort of be atrophied by the fact that you're not allowing anything else to sort of nourish it.
I think the idea that you had to be sinless to contain the God child is given to us as Moses.
Mm-hmm.
Moses he starts irradiating, and people can't look at him because of the energy coming out of him. So he has to put his head in a cloth, and so I think that gives us the idea that something had to change in the structure, the anatomical. The atoms had to change.
Mm-hmm.
The atoms had to have a total new energy to them.
Right.
Because you're thinking of irradiation, which is atoms that are energized to a higher level and then come down to a lower level and irradiate that energy off.
Right.
It's just amazing.
And the way I think about it too is, we can never talk about, and this is something that when I make my forthcoming video series on the Incarnation by St. Athanasius, I've already written this one down, Jim. I've already decided to do this. Yeah. I hope you're compiling all of this, so I'll remember what I said I was going to do when I take that sabbatical here in a few years and write all the books I've claimed I'm going to write. People say, well, you can only, you take a year off, you can only write one book. I'm like, no. I wrote a book one time in like a month, actually just shy of a month. The month of November is National Novel. It wasn't a very long book, and it wasn't a very difficult one to write, but National Novel Writing Month is the month of November, and the goal is to write a 50,000 word novel in 30 days, and I hit 50,000 on like day 22. It also helped that I was basically taking my vocation story and fictionalizing it and using Dante's Divine Comedy as a frame narrative for it. So I had seriously 9 pages of notes for a like 100 and some page novel. It wasn't difficult to do.
Not on Amazon.
It's not on Amazon now. I have 2 printed copies of it, but I had, because one of the things you got that year was if you finished, they would give you a coupon. There was this like self-publishing thing. They would give you a coupon for 5 free copies of your novel. And I forget what happened to the other 3. I think I gave them to people, but anyway. But one of the things Athanasius is very careful to do when he's talking about the incarnation is not to impose necessity upon God. That he won't say God had to do this way. He won't even say that God had to become incarnate, because we can't impose necessity upon God. God acts in a totally free and sovereign manner with everything he does. Which actually that wording, free and sovereign, John Paul II uses to describe why there were not female apostles and why there were not women called to the priesthood. That Jesus did this in a free and sovereign manner. He wasn't just being a product of his times because he bucked societal trends constantly. That's part of why he got killed, was that he was sort of clashing with the way of things. But God acts in a free and sovereign manner, so we can't say God had to do it this way. God didn't have to have an immaculately conceived person be the mother of his son. He didn't have to have his son born in the usual human way. He didn't have to, this is the most fitting way. And not just fitting because it is sort of more seemly for God to do this, but it's more fitting for us. It's the thing that's going to impact us the best. So look at the fact that Jesus was born in the what we now call kind of the end of the last century BC, the beginning of the first century. Jesus is born at this time. If Mary were sinful and Jesus were wrapped in a sin-proof membrane to keep him from being corrupted and to keep him from destroying his mother, nobody would have understood that. That wouldn't have made any sense to anybody. And it would have been, there are things like that in ancient religions. And it's one of the things that I think kind of doesn't help the mythology to stand up sometimes. So in our case, the most fitting thing was that we have a pure and immaculate mother as the fitting vessel for bringing the Son of God into the world. And that's even going to appeal to Jewish sensibilities, because everything that's said of Mary, and particularly when you get to Revelation 12, Mary is the Ark of the Covenant. That the Ark of the Covenant prefigures who Mary is. And so going back to, if you accidentally touch the Ark of the Covenant, then you die. So having a pure, and it's even seen there in Luke's gospel, the Holy Spirit will overshadow you. The last time in Scripture that word is used is when talking about the Spirit of God overshadowing the Ark. That the presence of God overshadows Mary in this very special way. And so the fathers very quickly picked up on the fact that you have here the presence of God overshadows her, and contained within the Ark of the Old Covenant was the priestly rod of Aaron, the manna in the desert, and the tablets of the law. Contained within the new Ark was the great high priest, the bread that came down from heaven, and the lawgiver who brings the new law of the new covenant. And so Mary then, the Mary is seen prefigured in the Ark of the Covenant, because Jesus is the covenant himself. And again, that makes a whole lot more sense than talking about membranes. And the part of what did it for me was this guy, his rhetorical style. He kept just saying membrane over and over and over again, and it was just like, first off, it's kind of gross. That's not a pleasant sounding word about the 16th time you've heard it in 5 minutes, but anyway. One of the reasons, so another kind of big development here is right before the definition of the Immaculate Conception. You have the apparitions of Mary at Lourdes, and this is one of the ways they validated the apparition, was that Bernadette reported that the woman, and she never identified her as Mary, and the woman actually, if you read the transcripts, never identifies herself as Mary. But they kind of figure out, well, that's who it's kind of got to be. Because she said, how she did introduce herself is, I am the Immaculate Conception. Bernadette wouldn't have made that up because that wasn't in the news yet, basically. That phrasing would not have been as familiar to, especially to somebody like her, who was a barely literate, peasant girl. Fun fact about St. Bernadette, when there's a really good article came out several years ago. I was in seminary when it came out on, I think, Catholic World Report, about the history of the church's relationship with tobacco, and how when tobacco first starts to become a thing in Europe in about the 16th century, that the church was scrambling to try to figure out what to do about it, because you had some bishops are a little more permissive about it, some are not. Some think it's the most horrible thing in the world. They did the same thing with coffee, when it starts to creep its way in a couple of centuries before that. But you eventually will have like popes laying excommunications on priests who use tobacco, or forbidding its use at the altar and things like that, because priests would take snuff at the altar. And snuff, of course, was snorted up the nose. In the 19th century, and tobacco has always been treated as a materia medica. It's always been used for its curative powers. And there are some of those that are actually true. If you get a bee sting, once you get the stinger out, if you lay a little bit of tobacco on it, it's supposed to help kind of draw the venom out. But Bernadette was given a snuff box full of snuff to help with her asthma, because it was believed that snorting dried tobacco up your nose helped with your asthma. And she kept getting in trouble in school because she would share her snuff with her classmates. So it's kind of the inverse thing. I mean, really what the teacher should have said is, well, I hope you brought enough for everybody, But anyway, that was one of my other favorite tobacco story in the church was when St. Vincent de Paul was up for canonization. Of course, one of the things they do is they exhume the body and they examine it to see maybe there's some kind of miraculous occurrence or something. If the body is incorrupt, that isn't a definitive proof that the person is in heaven, but also it's kind of it leans in that direction basically, because that's kind of a miraculous occurrence sometimes. And they examined him and they found that his sinus tissue had turned to dust, that there was like nothing behind his eyes basically. And other than that, he was in really good shape, but like that. And so the devil's advocate, whose job was to argue against the canonization of the person, to try to find as many vicious tendencies and things like that as they could, to try to argue against the heroic virtues and argue against even the miracles and things, said, well, clearly he's not incorrupt, so he can't be a saint. And the advocate then responds, the reason that his sinus tissue had rotted was that he used tobacco. And then the devil's advocate points out, well, that's a really bad habit. And so that can't count. And then the advocate responds that he used tobacco because the nicotine helped to keep him alert at night so he could keep long vigils of prayer. And that ended up being a point in his favor. So I'm not saying that tobacco use will make you holier for legal purposes. I can't say that. But that's right up there with one of my favorite logic problems ever. Qui vivit. Well, I'm getting there. Qui vivit dormit. Qui dormit non peccat. Qui non peccat sanctus est. Ergo, qui vivit sanctus est, which means he who drinks sleeps, he who sleeps does not sin, he who does not sin is holy. Therefore, he who drinks is holy.
Okay, Jim just was thinking about that.
Absolutely nothing. That is a
No, it's
airtight.
It is an airtight.
It's a valid argument. The question is as to its soundness, because a valid argument can also be all dogs are cats, all cats are mice, therefore all dogs are mice. That's a valid argument. It's just not a sound one because it's not true. So, but I will leave that for your contemplation. The next really big development is one that I'm fond of talking of because he's my favorite pope, Pope Leo XIII. He was called the Pope of the Rosary. I call him the most underrated pope of modern times. Why we haven't canonized Leo XIII, I will never understand. We've canonized every other pope in the last 200 years. I don't understand why we haven't canonized him. He was the pope from 1878 to 1903. His election was a fascinating story because Pius IX had just been the pope. He was the second longest reigning pope in history. He ruled for 31 years. And generally what you do then after you've had a pope be pope for a long time is you elect somebody who's really old, who's probably going to die after a couple of years, to give the cardinals some time to kind of circle the wagons and figure out who they really want to elect as pope. That actually seems to have been the case with the last three popes. John Paul was pope for 26 years. And so you want to elect somebody who's going to be kind of a placeholder for a few years who isn't going to shake things up too much and then is going to die, and then we'll elect who we really want. There are rumors, we don't really know because of the secrecy of the conclave, there are rumors that Francis was who they really wanted in 2005, and that he actually was a major vote getter, but they end up going with Benedict as kind of a continuity figure until things can kind of come together and they can elect Francis. A lot of that is rumor and speculation, but the maxim, the Italian maxim goes something like always follow a fat pope with a skinny pope. The idea being that you elect somebody who's not going to last that long to succeed someone who did. That has almost never worked. And I say that because they elect Leo, who is a 68-year-old longtime Vatican diplomat. They figured he's kind of frail. He was tall and very thin and had some health issues and things. He lived to be 93. He was Pope from 1878 to 1903. He also shares a birthday with John Bon Jovi, but other random little things about him. Even when he died, the story of his death is actually a little bit humorous because he's lying there and he's near the end, and you can tell he's near the end because he just looks very sickly and he's breathing funny. And so all the cardinals gather around and they ask for his last blessing, and he very weakly raises his hand and gives his blessing. And then they just kind of all stand there, in tears, praying and just waiting. They've given him the last rites. And then he's lying there, dying. And then he opens his eyes and he kind of looks around and he gets up and he puts on his robe and he walks over to his desk and he's answering letters and he sits down in his chair. And they're sitting here stunned, like, he didn't really die. So he does this. They all kind of leave and kind of go about their business. And about a week later, they come back and do this all again. And then he still repeated this. He got up and he went back to his breviary and so he didn't die again. And then it took him on the third attempt, he finally did about a week later. It took him about 2 weeks to finally actually die. And that's where the custom of kind of tapping him on the forehead and calling his name originated, was just to make sure that he was really dead. It's amazing how often we look at why certain church practices existed at certain periods because they contain the phrase to make sure he was really dead. You had a period in the Middle Ages where people were buried with a bell hanging from their tombstone and a rope tied to their wrist to make sure that we didn't bury anybody alive, because that happened there for a little while. That's why Thomas à Kempis, who wrote The Imitation of Christ, is not Saint Thomas à Kempis, is because they exhumed him when they were investigating canonizing him and found that there was some evidence that he had been buried alive. And we don't know the state of his soul at death. So, yeah. But anyway, Leo the 13th. The other time this didn't work is that after Pius XII had been Pope for a really long time and had been hugely influential on the world stage, they elect John the 23rd. They figure he's old. He's probably not going to last very long. And then he calls an ecumenical council. So that generally doesn't work. Leo, in his 25-year papacy, promulgated 85 encyclical letters, which sounds like a lot, until you consider that the lengthy theological tome of the encyclical letter isn't really a thing until more recent times. That you get into about Paul VI and John Paul II is where encyclicals start being a little more beefed up. You get into Pope Francis's incomprehensible 45,000-word exhortations and things like that. But at that time, some encyclical letters were 2 or 3 pages long. The other thing that really helped is that his Leo the 13th's brother was a cardinal and was a Jesuit theologian and was a well-respected social thinker, and he probably wrote most of it. That he wrote a lot of it, and like I said at the very beginning, popes have ghostwriters and have for centuries. I think you can make a pretty good argument that St. Paul himself had a couple of, not really ghostwriters, but definitely people dictating, he was dictating to. But 13 of Leo's 85 encyclicals are about the rosary. And it's interesting that he doesn't just encourage the rosary as a nice thing to do, and doesn't even just encourage it as something essential to being Christian. But Leo is writing in an age where, again, this is the end of the 19th century. Pius IX, his predecessor, was the first pope to be the prisoner in the Vatican, that the papal states are ceded to Italy, and now the pope's temporal prestige has been reduced from a kingdom that was about half of the Italian peninsula to a few blocks in the Vatican City. And so he has no temporal power anymore, and so now the pope's focus is going to start to shift. And there's a sort of period there between really those 3 popes, Pius IX and Leo the 13th and Pius X, where the church is kind of transitioning its sort of role and its relationship with the modern world. And around this time too, the age of the monarchs is coming to an end. And again, in a big way with Pius X, the period of Pius X and World War I, that kind of the old Europe is passing away and the old sort of nature of Western civilization is being remade into one that is more kind of first off centered on democratic sorts of governments. And again, this is where socialism and communism start to become realities. If you read Leo XIII's encyclicals, almost every single one of them has something to do with socialism and communism and atheism, and even the ones that don't are still very concerned with social ills. And so he recommends the rosary as a means of dealing with these things. In his encyclical of, 1891, called Octobri Mense, which means the month of October, he's talking about how the month of October is dedicated to the rosary. Universal and well-known are the evils we deplore. War made upon the sacred dogmas which the church holds and transmits. Derision cast upon the integrity of that Christian morality which she has in keeping. Enmity declared with the impudence of audacity and with criminal malice against the very Christ. As though the divine work of redemption itself were to be destroyed from its foundation, that work which indeed no adverse power shall ever utterly abolish or destroy. No new events are these in the career of the church militant. Jesus foretold them to his disciples. But he goes on to say that, he laments the fact that people have become indifferent to religion. So many Catholics should be such in name only and should pay to religion no honor or worship. And still sadder and more beset with anxieties grows the soul at the thought of the fruitful source of most manifold evils existing in the organization of states that allow no place to the church and that oppose her championship of holy virtue. This is truly a terrible manifestation of the just vengeance of God who allows blindness of soul to darken upon the nations that forsake him. A little bit of a downer to start out with. But then he talks about those whose actions have disturbed their consciences need an intercessor mighty in favor with God, merciful enough not to reject the calls of the desperate, merciful enough to lift up again towards hope in the divine mercy the afflicted and the broken down. Mary is this glorious intermediary. She is the mighty mother of the Almighty. But what is still sweeter, she is gentle, extreme in tenderness, of a limitless loving kindness. As such, God gave her to us. Having chosen her for the mother of his only begotten Son, he taught her all a mother's feeling that breeds nothing but pardon and love. Such Christ desired she should be, for he consented to be subject to Mary and obey her as a son, a mother. And so he's basically talking about, and he'll move on then to say that the rosary is really the fitting sort of prayer we offer for Mary's intercession, especially because it is a meditation on the gospel. And in the face of a time that is so tempestuous and so consumed with falsehood and so many attacks on the church and the standing of the church having been lost, that the rosary is a fitting way to address these sort of social ills. And he recommends that people pray the rosary at home, but also that the rosary continue to be a devotion that is seen in public, because this will help to sort of evangelize this culture that is rapidly deteriorating. So again, you can pretty much name the theme of every encyclical of Leo XIII, look at what the main topic is, and then add to that he's going to talk about social ills. Arcanum Divine is one of his more interesting encyclicals. It's about marriage. And it basically is, the premise of it is, if the state gets a hold of the institution of marriage, then society is doomed. That if the state gets to define what marriage is and reduces it to a mere social contract, then society is doomed.
And here we are.
And here we are. The next big development, we're going to skip ahead several decades. The Second Vatican Council in Lumen Gentium, which is the dogmatic constitution on the church in the modern world, includes a whole chapter. Chapter 8 of Lumen Gentium is about Mary and Mary's role in the plan of salvation. And so in there, in paragraphs, where did we go here? Paragraphs 66 and 67, the council speaks of kind of the importance of Marian devotion. A couple of highlights from that. The various forms of piety towards the Mother of God, which the Church has approved within the limits of sound and orthodox doctrine, according to the dispositions and understanding of the faithful, ensure that while the mother is honored, the Son, through whom all things have their being, and in whom it has pleased the Father that all fullness should dwell, is rightly known, loved, and glorified, and his commandments are observed. Then it moves on to say that the cult, or the honor paid to Mary, especially the liturgical cult of the Blessed Virgin, should be generously fostered, that all the practices and exercises of devotion towards her, recommended by the teaching authority of the Church in the course of centuries, be highly esteemed, and that those decrees which were given in the early days regarding the cult images of Christ, the Blessed Virgin, and the saints be religiously observed. It then goes on to warn against false exaggeration, as from too summary an attitude in considering the special dignity of the Mother of God. So there are certain periods in the Church's history where certain authors and preachers are going to appear to give far too much honor, or kind of give Mary credit for having more power than she of herself does. And we should avoid that. Let them rightly illustrate the duties and privileges of the Blessed Virgin, which always refer to Christ, the source of all truth, sanctity, and devotion. Let them, this is kind of an interesting phrase here, sort of a sensitivity to people outside the Church. Let them carefully refrain from whatever might by word or deed lead the separated brethren or any others whatsoever into error about the true doctrine of the Church. In other words, we need to do Marian devotion right, we need to do it well, and we need to do it in a way that's authentic to what we teach, and not in a way that might appear that we are worshiping Mary, basically, because this is one of the biggest critiques of the Church. And I think it's helpful that that's in there. Let the faithful remember, moreover, that true devotion consists neither in sterile or transitory affection, nor in a certain vain credulity, but it proceeds from the true faith, by which we are led to recognize the excellence of the Mother of God, and we are moved to a filial love towards our Mother, and to the imitation of her virtues. So the next time someone tells you that Vatican II did away with the Rosary, refer them to Vatican II.
So what would be some of the practices that would be over, would be construed as worshiping Mary? What would you say about?
I'm not really sure, because the thing about that is that every practice I could think of that might appear to be kind of over the top, you could make a pretty good argument as to why you're doing it and still have it kind of be within, I mean, as long as you're not like literally, preaching or singing that Mary is the fourth person of the Trinity or something like that. I could see how certain kind of more regional kind of, every region, every culture, just about every country has its own kind of Marian title or Marian image or something like that. And I could see how you could make some argument that, much as I am not want to speak ill of the dead, when I was in high school, I went to Liberty University for a week for Boys' State, and me and another Catholic walked around and we counted the number of images of Jerry Falwell on campus, and then we counted the number of images of Jesus, and the ratio was 31-1, and not in favor of Jesus. And so when I toured Belmont Abbey, I told my mother, I said, the Jesus to Jerry Falwell ratio is much better at this school, because there weren't any images of Jerry Falwell. But I think you could make some argument that, the ubiquity of certain Marian images and things and certain practices. I think the bigger problem nowadays, and part of this is a function of the fact that we live in an era of unprecedented access to information. Anybody who cares to know this will be able to look up on the internet and see the Catholics don't worship Mary. That's kind of settled. It's kind of like why I say the book by Carl Keating, Catholicism and Fundamentalism, that was one of the first books about Catholicism I read, that was a book about Protestant fundamentalist anti-Catholicism, doesn't really have the validity that it did when it came out in 1988. And it's because that kind of Protestant fundamentalist anti-Catholicism is not the cultural force that it was 20 or 30 years ago. That it isn't quite to the front and center of American culture. But now the bigger religious sort of cultural forces are either to be irreligious or to be in one of these like seeker churches or something like that. That, I mean, you go to even some of these that will identify as Baptist or Pentecostal or something, kind of in the cities, especially the storefront churches and the mega church sort of phenomenon. And if you ask them if they have a problem with what Catholics teach about Mary, they first off probably won't know, and second off, they probably don't care that much. That there's less of a sense of, here are the doctrines that set us apart, and more of the sense of, hey, we're kind of loosely all in this together. There aren't hard lines being drawn. And so I would say that the bigger problem now is not the impression that we give to others, but how it plays out in practice among some of the faithful. The fact that on the 12th of December, there will be 200 people at Mass that then 2 weeks later won't be there for Christmas, because they'll come for Our Lady of Guadalupe, but then they don't come the rest of the year. I have a priest friend who on the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, his homily was, are we happy today to be celebrating the Blessed Virgin? And they're, yeah. Do you think Mary is happy with us? And they're, yeah. No, she's not, because she doesn't see you here the rest of the time. And that I think is the problem, is that in a lot of, and it isn't just with Our Lady of Guadalupe, because you see this in other countries and with other Marian devotions, and this even happens in Europe, to some extent too. Mary is reduced to a cultural figure. And it's not that Mary isn't a cultural figure. Mary's role in culture is extremely important. It's just that Mary is more than a cultural figure. And so when we turn our Marian feasts and Marian observances into a mere cultural observance, that if the only time you come to church all year is the day of your national Marian feast day, then your priorities are kind of backwards. And so that, I think, is the bigger problem in 2021. 20 years ago, I would have said there was that we do need to be careful about, kind of avoiding that appearance of worshiping Mary. And I could see certain things, but I think the bigger problem is now that, by and large, a lot of people don't worship anything. And so, if that kind of makes sense. I mean, this is my observation. This is just my opinion on this.
So, I mean,
I remember when Pope John Paul II became Pope. I remember hearing, 78, 79, and I remember hearing other Catholics saying, well, he's going to, because of his devotion to Mary, that he's going to make her, raise her to a divinity status. And I said, that can't even happen.
Well, it can't happen, and he himself would not have been inclined toward that.
I know. And these were Catholics I was talking about. I can hear the Protestant, I can understand saying that. But
Right.
It's interesting,
They weren't
because one of the
Catholics.
things, at least it seems I've heard about him before too, was how he always, wherever he went, he would stop in front of a tabernacle, and he would spend all kinds of time in front of the Blessed Sacrament. So why weren't they saying maybe, adoration type things come back instead of Mary? But I was going to say, if one of the things of watching the Holy Land Rosary, saying the Rosary with that's on EWTN, that impressed me was when they do with the Assumption, and there's the Church of the Assumption in the Holy Land. Did you go to that when you were there? So they show all the different images. They're all the cultures. And more recently, when there was, all the tearing down of the statues and various things, and there was the argument from some of these people about Mary, about the fact of it being, white Caucasian images or whatever. Was, if you look at those, what I saw, I haven't seen it personally, but there was the one from Africa. And she's depicted as a African with children, and then the one from Japan, and the one from, all the different countries. And I thought, how could it be confused? Because obviously people in those countries have seen her in their own image. And it goes the other way too, that a lot of times in Marian apparitions, Mary will appear in the garb of the culture she's again, Our Lady of Guadalupe, she's dressed as an Aztec maiden that she's depicted, one of my favorite depictions like that, there's an American artist by the name of Daniel Mitsui. And Daniel is, he's Japanese, his ancestry is Japanese, but fantastic artist. And he does a lot of prints, and he will do Japanese versions, like using kind of traditional Japanese style of various aspects of the faith. So like his Saint Michael is a winged samurai who's defeating like a kind of Chinese style dragon.
but his images of like Jesus and Mary, like the wedding at Cana, the couple is dressed in traditional Japanese wedding garb. Like the bride is wearing a very, very sumptuous kimono. And then Mary is there as well. And again, she's dressed up as he even depicts them as Japanese people. And so I've always found those especially kind of fascinating. But yeah, I mean, there's a long history of people will talk about all the white Caucasian images of Jesus and Mary and things like that, and they'll bang the drum really hard for no, we need to depict them in this Middle Eastern fashion. Or you even have some people in certain groups that are a little bit more radical with kind of their racial ideology, where they'll say that Jesus was black, Jesus was definitely Middle Eastern, he wasn't African, but it doesn't actually matter. And every culture has at various points depicted him in a way that's kind of intelligible to the audience, and it's something about the point of iconography is, again, to convey truth. And so rather than trying for museum quality authenticity, that we depict Mary in a way, or we depict Jesus in a way that's going to be culturally relevant so that you get who it is that this is without kind of obscuring the actual truth of who it is. So Mary in Greek icons like Perpetual Help, she's dressed as a Byzantine empress. So if you were looking at this image in the 6th or 7th century, that image you wouldn't be, because it was made in probably about the 12th century. But you're looking at this image in 12th century Greece, and you're going to be able to say Mary is clearly somebody of some status because of the way she's dressed. This doesn't mean anything to us because we don't have any Byzantine empresses wandering around anymore. But I think the world would be better off if we had a few more Byzantine empresses.
Well, I mean, that's what I was thinking, is that when you show all the art over
Right.
all the ages, it's always portrayed in what I think at the time what people look like.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you see the some of the images that come out of the Renaissance, well, they look like Renaissance people. If you look at the images from all the way up to the modern times, so it seems to me that people see them as whatever, like you're saying, the culture where they are in, because somehow that has been depicted by the artists. I mean, the artists see it that way.
Yeah.
So one little thing I'll skip over here real quick to get to the last point. Pope Paul VI comes out in 1974 with Marialis Cultus for the right ordering and development of devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Interesting that this comes out the year after he releases Humanae Vitae. I don't know if that was kind of on purpose or in response to that or what, but that's a whole other can of worms at the moment. It comes out on February 2nd, 1974, which is the feast of the Presentation. Popes typically would release documents on kind of significant feast days and things. The one of John Paul II I'm going to talk about in a minute came out on the Feast of the Annunciation in 1987. But he gives kind of and you can see this is quite a lengthy exhortation. But it's about following from what the Second Vatican Council said about Marian devotion in those 2 paragraphs. He kind of expands on that, encourages families to pray the rosary, encourages, again, sort of a rightly grounded devotion to Mary.
What's the name of that?
Marialis Cultus. John Paul II is remembered as a pope who, like you say, quite devoted to Mary. His coat of arms contains a version of the image that's found on the back of the miraculous medal. There's a cross kind of offset, and then underneath it is an M, which actually got him into a little bit of heraldic trouble when he first became pope. And at the time, Bruno Hahn was still alive. Bruno Hahn is widely regarded as one of the greatest heraldic experts in the history of the church. He was a Vatican diplomat who also designed coats of arms, and he designed the coats of arms of, I think, about 5 popes. But he was consulted because John Paul had used that design on his coat of arms when he was a bishop. And it's really considered poor form to put writing on a coat of arms. And so to put an M on there was thought to be that's why you'll sometimes see bishops will put some kind of Marian monogram or something on there. And the critique of that is that there are like 700 other ways to represent Mary, and that, writing on that. There was one bishop recently who his name was Marian, which actually comes from the Greek word used for holy oils. And so he put a vase that was supposed to be of the sacred chrism. And on the vase, he put SC for the sacred chrism. And one of the heraldic, kind of people I follow commented on that, was like, there was no reason to do that. Like, the little vase itself was sufficient, or you could have put like almost anything else kind of depict that, but it's a little too on the nose and writing is considered kind of bad manners. But Archbishop Bruno Hahn researches this and says that actually John Paul II is Polish, and there's actually a history in Polish heraldry of putting markings that sort of resemble letters, and so that was actually that was okay, that he didn't really have to change it basically to have kind of better form. Don't get me started on Pope Francis's coat of arms. John Paul had a good one. Benedict's was excellent. Benedict's was beautiful. Leo XIII had a really neat one. John Paul I actually had one of the coolest ones in modern times. But anyway,
For 81 days.
yeah, 33 days.
33.
Yeah, only 33 days.
I don't know where that is.
Yeah.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah.
If you think about it.
Yeah, yeah. The mafia were waiting for Owen.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well-being Catholic.
So John Paul, right off the bat, it's very obvious that he has a devotion to Mary, and like you say, there were even rumors that he was going to make Mary a goddess or something, which again he can't do, and he wouldn't have done. The motto on his coat of arms was "Totus tuus," totally yours, showing his warm devotion to Mary, especially under the title of Mater Ecclesiae, Mother of the Church. There was an image installed on the facade of St. Peter's Basilica of Mary under this title. And he would write extensively about Mary under this title, Mother of the Church. One of his successors, Pope Francis, actually instituted a feast of Mary, Mother of the Church. That's the day after Pentecost, and so the Monday after Pentecost Sunday is now is always the feast of Mary, Mother of the Church. John Paul II, again, devotee of the Rosary, and really promotes this. Devotee of the brown scapular, promotes this devotion as well. Wore it himself. I think he actually was a Carmelite tertiary, so he would have worn it as part of his attachment to the Carmelites. He credited Mary with saving him from assassination in 1981 when he was shot. He said that it is because the bullet just narrowly missed hitting anything that could have killed him. He said that there was a hand that guided the bullet, and he credits Mary with having saved his life. The assassination attempt occurred on, I think it was on the Feast of Our Lady of Fatima, actually, and so he credits Mary under that title with having saved his life. He went to Fatima shortly after he recovered, and he placed the bullet into the crown on the statue of the Virgin, and you can actually still see it if you go to Fatima and you go to the little museum off to one side of the Esplanade. There's the crown, and the bullet is kind of up underneath the little cross on it. He wrote an encyclical entitled Redemptoris Mater, Mother of the Redeemer, on the Blessed Virgin Mary and the life of the Pilgrim Church. It's interesting to read his encyclicals because he's always very good about kind of saluting who came before. So he talks about the Second Vatican Council. He talks about Paul VI, Marialis Cultus, in writing this, and how he's just trying to build on what his predecessors did. Benedict XVI does this quite a lot too, pays a lot of homage to, especially John Paul, but to others who came before him. John Paul, in his social encyclicals, will do this. Centesimus Annus is written on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, which is Leo XIII's sort of foundational social encyclical. So it was written in 1991, Centesimus Annus was, and it basically could be described as, here's why communism fell, and it's because Leo XIII was right about everything, and we should listen to everything that he says. That it was more or less a 50-page vindication of Leo XIII's entire project. But anyway, so Redemptoris Mater is going to be John Paul II's Marian teaching. Again, quite a substantial document, but he gives us, in this document, he proclaims a Marian year. He declares 1987 into 88 to be a year specially dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Popes will do this from time to time. He declared 2000 to be a Jubilee year. Benedict declared a year for priests and a year of the Eucharist. Pope Francis declared a year of mercy. I was ordained during the year of mercy. That's perhaps why I'm so unmerciful. I wasn't really paying attention. Pope Francis, it was so funny. Pope Francis declared a year of St. Joseph this year. After last year, we had just finished celebrating our year of St. Joseph in the Diocese of Charlotte. And I sent somebody like an internet meme that said the Diocese of Charlotte and Pope Francis declares a year of St. Joseph, one step ahead of you there, boss. So anyway, so John Paul II, I don't wish to give the impression that Marian teaching of the church ended in 1987 and then nobody said anything about it since. Obviously, Pope Benedict had a lot to say about it. Pope Francis has had a lot to say. Pope Francis is noted for, before he goes on a pilgrimage and when he returns from one, he stops at the Basilica of St. Mary Major, where there's an ancient icon of Mary, Mary under the title of Salus Populorum Romanum, the salvation of the people of Rome. And he has a devotion to her. The devotion to Mary under the title of Undoer of Knots gained a lot of popularity when Pope Francis was first elected because he had a devotion when he was in Europe studying, when he was still, he encountered the image. The image is actually a German one. And he had a copy of the image placed in his rooms from then on, and it's become an extremely popular devotion. There's a novena that you pray to Our Lady Undoer of Knots, where you bring before Mary. You pray the Rosary each day, and there's a series of prayers that go with it, and you bring before Mary some particular difficulty or kind of difficult cause that needs resolution, some knot that needs to be untied in your life. And there have been a lot of people attribute a lot of favors to this devotion as well. I actually, I'll close on this because it's hilarious. A friend of mine was supposed to be going to the Holy Land in January in 2017. In January 2017, we had a really bad series of snowstorms all up and down the East Coast. And she had texted me from the airport in Newark and said, "Pray for us. We're not sure we're going to be able to make it to Tel Aviv tonight." And I said, well, here's what we'll do. In college, we weren't sure which Marian devotion we should have, so we combined all of them. And I drew an image called Our Lady of Practically Everything. And so Mary is holding Jesus and a scepter and has a rosary dangling off one arm and has a scapular dangling off the other. And she's dressed as a Byzantine empress and also is Our Lady of Guadalupe. I mean, I just took all the Our Ladies and combined them all together. So we're really good at sewing these things together. So I'm going to take Our Lady of the Snows, commemorated on August 5th, because August 5th, you may notice, is in the middle of the summer. And in Rome, it's not known to be cold in the middle of the summer. But there was a miracle where snow fell on this hill in Rome on the 5th of August. And it was from a Marian apparition. And that's where the Basilica of Mary Major is now located. So we'll combine Our Lady of the Snows and Our Lady Undoer of Knots and have Our Lady Undoer of Snows. And so when she got back, she worked at the parish I was at the time. When she got back, they ended up being able to go and had a really good time in the Holy Land and all. When they got back, I got a statue of Our Lady Undoer of Knots, and she's holding her hands kind of like this. And I bought a dollhouse snow shovel and super glued it to her hands and left that on my friend's desk. And so Our Lady Undoer of the Snows. And I actually have a picture because a few weeks later, it was one, I think it was in February of that year. One morning we woke up and there was like 1.5 feet of snow on the ground. And it was like 17 degrees and just, I mean, like Charlotte, like once in a decade you see something like that in Charlotte. But also because in Charlotte, 6 hours later, the temperature had shot up to 75 degrees and all the snow melted off by like sundown. But while the snow was melting, it was middle of the afternoon. I was between masses and stuff. I went to her office and I grabbed the statue and I walk out to the kind of the courtyard of the church, and you could see the sun is shining and the flowers are blooming again. And all around though, there's like snow melting. And so I put Our Lady Undoer of the Snows there and made that my background. And unfortunately, the original statue has been broken and discarded, and I haven't had a chance to make a new one yet. But when I do, I'm going to actually keep one this time.
I was going to say, maybe you need to keep that.
But I do have the photo, and I'm thinking about having like a print made of that or something, because that was one of the more ridiculous things I've ever done. So
That's a book.
Yeah.
What?
The most ridiculous things you've ever
Yeah.
done.
No. The problem with that book would be precisely this. So I have a goddaughter, and she has 2 little sisters, and I like to buy them things. And one year at Christmas, I forget what I got them, but then the next year I tried to one-up that. And then the next year I tried to one-up that. And then I remember I'm dealing with small children, and they're not going to remember, and they're not going to really rank what I gave them. They're not going to be mad at me if I gave them something crappier this year than I did last year. And I'm glad I had that realization, because I told their mother at one point, I'm like, I'm at the point now where if I keep doing this, by the time the oldest one turns 16, I'll be getting her a Ferrari. So,
Right. You have to be careful about your shoes.
Father,
yes.
the Our Lady of Czestochowa,
Mhm.
Is it a perpetual?
It's a different image. Czestochowa is a different.
No, but I thought they were trying to burn it to the Germans.
Yeah, but that's not perpetual help. It's a different image. But yeah, no, it wasn't the Germans. The church it was in had survived a couple of fires. But the image, she already had kind of darker skin in that image anyway.
Yeah.
That was actually a fairly common depiction. Like Our Lady of Montserrat in Barcelona.
Okay.
She was carved in like black stone. So she was black paint, but yeah. Some of that comes from, there's a line in Song of Songs, and the Song of Songs is sometimes there are lines in it that are associated with Mary. That when the woman is speaking, there's one part where she says, I am dark but beautiful. And so at a certain period, generally like kind of around the early Middle Ages, you start seeing depictions of Mary where she is shown with a lot darker skin as a reflection of that.
I thought it was because they were trying to destroy it with
No, I don't think
fire.
I don't think the Germans got a hold of Czestochowa, but the icon did survive multiple fires. The church that it was in had burned at different points in history, because things burned all the time until they fireproofed all the houses and the firemen just started burning books. But,
Right.
we'll alternate history
That'll
there.
be tomorrow.
That's right.
That'll be tomorrow.
That'll be tomorrow. Yes, tomorrow the exciting conclusion of Fahrenheit 451. So, any other questions or comments? Or I should probably edit out this part of the video for legal purposes. That is a joke. Jim highlights everything I say for legal purposes. That is a joke. Like everything that I'm referring to.
It's still recording.
Oh, I know. Yeah. So, all right. Well, like I say, the series of talks for next month is now going to be a series of bulletin notes. And next month's book discussion, the dates are a little different, at least the first one, 3 Philosophies of Life by Peter Kraft. What he does in that book is he actually used to teach this as a class. He takes the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Job, and the Song of Songs, and he says they're the greatest works of philosophy ever written. And he turns them into a philosophical divine comedy. That Ecclesiastes is about futility, which is hell, and Job is about suffering, which is purgatory, and Song of Songs is about love, which is heaven. So fascinating kind of way of looking at it. And he has that kind of creative mind about things like this. So that'll be November's book. Not a long book, but a very rich read. So bring your Bible too, because that'll come up a lot. So, all right. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting.
Thank you.